All right, hello. This is Christian Idealism. Let me get rid of that. So, sorry for we were having, at least on my end, technical difficulties with the internet. So hopefully we don't crash in the middle of the stream. I'm here with Caleb Jackson. Here we're going to review the debate. It's going to be on God's existence. This is a fairly critical review, so we're not taking sides with Eric or Justin. We're going to be criticizing both. If there's something we agree with, obviously we'll make that clear. But this is mostly going to be a critical sort of examination of the debate. So I just want to let people know, like me and Caleb here, we're both theists. So obviously we agree with Eric's conclusion, but we may not agree with the way that Eric reaches his conclusion. So we'll get into that. But by the way, Caleb, thanks for coming on and joining me on this. So that way I have another.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for growing that wicked goatee. So, it's goes both ways.
All right, let's get started.
In this debate, and of course, my debate opponent, Justin Schieber. And thank you, Justin, for giving me the home field advantage. Given that this debate is between Justin and me, there are only two live options on the table for answering tonight's question: atheism and theism. If we define atheism as a position that God does not exist, and theism as a position that God does exist, then by eliminating one of these options, we are ultimately left with the only option that will answer tonight's question. With this in mind, Justin and I have agreed to present three arguments in favor of our position. And my three will be: 1, the existence of evil; 2, the existence of knowledge and rationality; and 3, the existence of the soul. And I will argue that the existence of these three are best supported by theism over atheism by arguing that if atheism were true, then we would not expect these three things to exist. Thus, if these three things do exist, then atheism is false. And if atheism is false, then theism is true and God does exist. With this in mind, consider my first argument. Premise 1, if atheism is true, then evil would not exist. 2, evil exists, therefore atheism is false.
Okay, wait. This is like hella fast, but it seems like a moral argument to me. I mean, maybe it seems kind of weird.
Yeah, and Justin, I think, is a moral Platonist, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that even the first premise of that is questionable. But even then, I think that arguments from evil are typically internal critiques, right?
Yeah.
They don't necessarily have to presuppose good. It's just saying if it were true, then there's an inconsistency with the existence of gratuitous evil. So I do feel like he's setting up a little bit of a straw man, not intentionally, but
yeah.
Now he does say later on in the debate that that evil requires consciousness. Like in sentience, which I guess is true. So I do agree that sentient life that has the ability to suffer is technically more probable under theism than atheism. But I do think that that's oversimplifying it, and the existence of like suffering in general may be negative, depending on what kind of suffering it is. So we'll see how. But it's definitely not an argument I would start off with. I think that's a more of a defense than an offensive argument. We'll see how it goes.
Yep.
And I will argue that the existence of these three are best supported by theism over atheism by arguing that if atheism were true, then we would not expect these three things to exist. Thus, if these three things do exist, then atheism is false. And if atheism is false, then theism is true and God does exist. With this in mind, consider my first argument. Premise 1, if atheism is true, then evil would not exist. 2, evil exists, therefore atheism is false. Now, it's been said that the existence of evil is one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God. However, in order for the atheist to assume evil exists, he must first assume two things. 1, that an objective moral standard exists, and 2, that there is teleology to life in the natural world.
I'm trying to think what would. Yeah, I mean, if we mean moral evil, then I would probably agree with this. But at least the second assumption, that seems to be not true because not all moral theories assume teleology. And I know that because I studied the history of ethics. So obviously the ancient view of ethics was that teleology was intrinsically linked to goodness, but that's not the case for modern ethics. A lot of modern ethicists don't use teleology in their assumption. So I think the first assumption I think is correct, but the second assumption I think is going a little bit too far. Not only that, but like, I mean, I'm pretty sure an atheist could accept teleology, unless Eric has some reason to think that he couldn't, right?
Well, you can accept it under like a quasi-evolutionary view if you have, I mean, it's not intentionally designed, but due to natural selection, it is based in its environment to perform certain functions like reproduction, and so suffering gets in the way of that. Now, granted, his first premise does put a more Platonic view of it than just a neo-Darwinian view of ethics. So I guess that's fair. But I agree with you. I haven't studied ethics as much as you have, but I do feel like teleological arguments kind of come off as arbitrary in terms of like, but why did God make it this way? Like, because that seems like it's kind of a cloaked divine command theory almost, of like, God designed it this way, therefore you ought to follow your design. But why is God's design good, or is it just, is God is this a good design, or is it just that God wanted to be that way and you have to follow it? Like, is there a higher reason? So that, to me, maybe that's just a basic objection, but that's the first question that comes to my mind.
Yeah, so definitely not a good start, I would say.
However, if neither of these assumptions can be accounted for on an atheistic worldview, then the existence of evil becomes an argument not against God, but against atheism. Regarding the first assumption, when we observe the features of objective morality, it becomes clear that the reason for its existence must be grounded in a source that is rational and sentient, necessary, eternal, personal, and transcendent, namely God. Hence, without God, there can be no objective moral standard. Now, much like a lie is a deviation of truth, so too evil is a deviation from...
So I'm going to go back to the linking structure. Yeah,
that is rational and sentient, necessary.
Okay, so rational.
I agree with necessary and eternal and transcendent, but
but authority. Okay, I think.
Yeah,
I'm trying to see where exactly. So teleological. So no, not all moral theories assume teleology in their. So that's the first problem. Authoritative. Okay, that's pretty uncontroversial, at least for morality.
Sure.
So within morality, within ethics, you have this idea of authoritative normativity. So that is true. It's prescriptive. It's universal.
It's something that you ought to do, basically. Just
so at least the key features of morality are correct. But but then once he gets to the grounding part, it's like, well, I feel like the atheist. There's a few ways you can go. One is you can say that they are grounded, but they're grounded in some Platonic form, right? So like some kind of moral Platonism, or you can go with a view which is I'm more sympathetic to this view. So this is a view that I would hold to, and I think atheists should go the same route, which is like basically moral truths are independent, like they're sort of like necessary in a way, right?
So do you take like do you take Swinburne's view that
I would take Swinburne's view plus Oppie's view? So I would take a combination of those two. So Oppie actually thinks that you don't need truth makers. So like because of that, because you don't need truth makers and moral claims are both logically necessary and they don't need a truth maker. So like there's nothing that makes them true, basically. They're just true by definition.
And just so the audience knows, like Swinburne's view is that, if I'm correct, is that moral truths exist as like these necessary truths, just like logical truths, and that God is perfectly good because he is omniscient and he's all wise. And so God always knows what the good is and will always do what's rational. And so God will always choose correctly in the good, just as God would always have correct knowledge of mathematical truths or whatever you want to pick. And so in that way, we're almost conceding one of the horns at the Euthyphro, right? And I think that would be something that would be brought up to Eric if I were Justin, in terms of the sure. And I know that the Euthyphro has been argued about a lot, but in terms of the personal aspect of it, in terms of, is that just arbitrary? Why is it that God, if you're going to say that it's grounded in God's nature, why is God's nature the way that it is? Why is it these features? And if you're going to say like it just has to be that way, as if there's a contradiction, then you're kind of appealing to these being logical truths, right? And if you're going to say that they don't have to be that way, then it does seem arbitrary as to why God's nature is that way rather than some other way. So I think that grounding them in a logical sense does help you with the unarbitrariness, but it seems to make it independent of God in that way, which is, I think, fine for the theist to say, as if he's all, he's perfectly noble. We can still say God is morally perfect without having to say that it is grounded in God himself. So I think Justin should, if I were him, I don't think he does, needs to push back on those points more if I were him.
Eternal, personal, and transcendent, namely God. Hence, without God, there can be no objective moral standard. Now, much like a lie is a deviation of truth, so too evil is a deviation from an objective moral standard. Therefore, if evil exists, then it is a deviation from an objective moral standard, and this objective moral standard can only be grounded in God. Putting the same point in reverse, evil requires an objective moral standard to exist, and an objective moral standard
an objective standard of the good, that to God, no, we don't need truth makers. Evil. Okay, I agree. Okay, evil does depend upon objective moral standard, but again, what do we mean by a moral standard? I mean, you could take so many different views on this, right? If you take a view where there's no truth makers, then like you don't technically need like this grounding relation, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like the laws of logic are not there's nothing that makes them true. They're just like true by definition, right? Through conceptual analysis or something like that. So
and you know what's interesting is that I think he would have been better off taking a moral epistemology argument instead of a moral ontology argument to say
I agree. Yeah,
moral truths existed, the
Moral-
chance of knowing them under evolution is less likely than is under theism. Now, he actually does, interestingly enough, pull an argument from reason in his third argument, like when he gets to it in his opening. I mean, I don't think Eric is a precept, so I think Eric does take the view that, as far as I know, that laws of logic are necessary, they're not grounded in God, but that God maybe reveals them to us, and he basically appeals to evolution arguments, naturalism, which we'll get to. Again, I don't want to go into that now, but I think that he would have been better off including the moral argument into that rather than oh no, I'm
sorry.
there we go.
I'm trying to no, I was trying to where is the I'm trying to see how this thing works. Okay, we'll just keep it right here. It's my fault.
So yeah, I think we covered that.
Okay.
Requires that God must exist. Hence, if God does not exist, then an objective moral standard does not exist. And if an objective moral standard does not exist, then evil cannot exist either. However, if evil does exist, then as concluded in my argument, atheism is false and God must exist. 2. The second assumption, the second prerequisite for the existence of evil, that the
Yeah, I'm wondering how he justifies this because at least modern moral theories don't assume teleology, so this will be interesting.
atheist must assume is the existence of teleology to life of the natural world. Briefly, teleology is a notion of a final cause, an objective goal or purpose to the way things are.
Yeah, that I mean, yeah, you can go that route. I mean, that's more ancient view of ethics, but like modern view of ethics don't use any notion of teleology. So I'm just wondering like how he's going to justify this kind of thing.
I'm not even sure if he does it.
Yeah.
But I think it's more of just an assertion. Unless I'm misremembering how this goes, we can see if he gives an argument for it.
Yeah. It is that for the sake of which something is brought about. It is the reason for which, i.e., the objective goal or purpose of something. Now, it's important to note that if there is no God, there can be no final causes to life in the natural world. There can only be efficient causes. In other words, if there's no God, then we can't say that we are evolving for the sake of something, because on atheism, our existence can't.
Well, not all moral theories assume teleology either. So
we're not. Yeah, but evolution doesn't hold that we're like goal oriented, that we're evolving into like the ultimate creature. Yeah. It's just based on the environment. So I mean, he's pointing out, yes, that's true that evolution isn't striving for a particular moral teleology, but I don't think that's relevant to what Justin would be saying. I don't think that would matter in his case.
Cannot be explained or derived from an objective final cause or teleological standard as if we exist for some objective goal or purpose, but rather can and must be explained purely in terms of efficient causes and not final causes. Hence, if there is no God, then there is no teleology to life in the natural world by default. Moreover, teleology implies that there is a way things ought to be, which entails the notions of proper function and of flourishing. To illustrate, consider how the existence of a bad phone presupposes the existence of teleology. First, a bad phone implies that there is a dysfunction and a...
Okay, so this is a bad argument for teleology, and the reason why is because it's trying to apply moral properties to dysfunctions. And like that's kind of the debate within ethics is like, okay, if something doesn't work properly, is that like a moral truth or is that just a functional truth? Right.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, you know what's weird is I think in William Lane Craig's debate with Sam Harris actually did this argument on his side, and Craig corrected him. So it's kind of funny how that's the other way around, where Harris was saying, well, you can have objectively bad and good moves in chess. And Craig rightly points out that that's kind of equivocating on the word good and bad in terms of like advantageous versus disadvantageous. And like in terms of if you want to win, here's how you win. Yes, it is true. And if you want to be in good health, there are objectively true things you can do to be in good health over some other things. But that's not really what ethics is, I think, in that way. Like unless Eric would want to appeal to like the harm principle, which I know he wouldn't, because I know he thinks that it goes beyond simply pain and harm, more than just biologically speaking. So if it's just fundamentally true that persons have value and should be respected, I don't think you can really appeal to a further teleology of that, as if God could have made people with in some other way where there wouldn't be have teleos, right? Like that just seems really strange to me.
Deviation from a proper function, meaning that there is something my phone ought to do, but it is not, which entails that there is an objective goal and purpose and final cause for which my phone was made. But now two further implications follow from the existence of teleology, namely that there is a design plan for which all of these notions of teleology must be in alignment with, which of course would imply that there must be a designer. And with respect to the phone, this would be something like Android or Apple. Now, let's apply this to life in the natural world and consider.
So that's another thing I would question the design plan to designer. I mean, you could just say it's a brute fact that it like, you know.
Yeah. Again, why make it one design plan over the other, right?
Yeah,
like,
very true.
And I think that you can have ethics within, like, I mean, granted, I haven't studied this as much as I'd like to, but I'd like to look into like Christian sexual ethics at some point, and there are a lot of natural law teleology arguments from that, and I don't necessarily find them overly persuasive, but I do think you can say that pragmatically there are reasons why, given the teleology we have, one ought not to do certain acts with certain parts of the body over others, given that it can have negative consequences to health and so forth like that. But I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with like loving someone or multiple people or anything like that in principle. But with our certain biology and our certain brain chemistry, yes, there are reasons why it may not be pragmatic here. So I think you can say that in certain situations, but I think to make a general statement seems strange to me, as if like that's a universal law. So I think it's much more broad than just teleos in that way. But yeah.
Consider an objection to the existence of God on the basis of a child being born with a fatal disease. A disease, by definition, is a disorder of structure or function. Hence, a disease implies dysfunction, which would imply a deviation from the existence of a proper function, which would imply that there is an ought to how the body should be acting, which is what gives rise to the proper function, and would imply an objective.
But you haven't so you're still going to face David Hume's guillotine in terms of like, how do you go? That's just describing what is the function of something, not what it ought to be.
Right. And we can say, given human biology, yes, the body's supposed to function a certain way, and diseases going off of that, and we try to correct that. Like, no, I don't think anyone would dispute that. But that doesn't mean that that's how our bodies ought to be, right? Like, you can say that if I'm choking, or if I have an esophagus that needs to be repaired, it ought to be a certain way. But I can also think of ways that my esophagus ought to be, even if it's normal. Like, even if you have a perfectly functioning one, why ought my esophagus be next to my windpipe where I can choke on food easily? Like, I can think of even better design plans that wouldn't be as dangerous. So to say that like the body ought to behave a certain way, then we can ask, but like, why isn't it a better way where you can't have all these disease, where you can't get hurt in the first place? So, you know, I feel like that's just a strange way to.
Sorry, I'm trying to find because there's ones where there's slides we can look at. Hold on. Where was it? Okay, I think we're right here, if I'm not mistaken. Okay.
Child being born with a fatal disease. A disease, by definition, is a disorder of structure or function. Hence, a disease implies dysfunction, which would imply a deviation from the existence of a proper function, which would imply that there is an ought to how the body should be acting, which is what gives rise to the proper function, and would imply an objective goal and objective purpose to life, which is where the goal stems from, which would imply a final cause, all of which would imply teleology to life in the natural world.
Okay, but so it's interesting that I don't know if you can see my my mouse, but so I'm wondering how it gets from the ought to life to the proper function. So like that's I feel like Hume's guillotine can apply here. It's like, okay, yeah, you're describing a function, but that doesn't tell you about how it ought to act in the moral sense.
Right. Speaking of oughts, I'm pretty sure you ought to pronounce it as guillotine and not guillotine, but
yeah, very true.
And see, you're misusing the teleology, since the word is used in a different way. So you've technically committed an evil, according to Eric's formulation.
Yeah. Anyways,
but again, if this is the case, then it infers some type of design plan, which would infer a designer, and hence something like God. So we can simplify this by saying that if a disease is evil, which implies dysfunction, and such things imply teleology.
Okay, that's not true. That's simply like, at least not true in modern moral theories. Again, it might be true in ancient ethical theories, like Aristotle or Aquinas, but like, I'm not sure why the atheist would have to grant. Like, I think that's kind of the whole point. The atheist wouldn't grant ancient views of ethics anyways. So yeah.
then God must exist as the foundation and reason for which there can be teleology to life in the first place. But if there is no God, then there can be no teleology, and thus evil cannot exist in this way. Hence, both of these two prerequisite assumptions for the existence of evil provide evidence for my first argument that if evil exists, then atheism is false. And if atheism is false, then as I said in my opening, theism is true and God must exist.
Okay, so his entire argument relies upon, there's a few things. Number one, it relies upon an ancient view of ethics, which most philosophers don't hold to. It implies that there can't be moral Platonist views about the foundations of ethics, and it completely ignores theistic views like myself, where you can have morality be independent of God, but just not be grounded in any sort of way, like, you know, some kind of like.
But God still reveals the truth to you. God still actively making those known, and it's not like as if he has no role in it whatsoever. In fact, that's the good is what's guiding his decisions, right? In fact, I think if you're going to say that the good isn't grounded in this like higher form, then you have to become a divine skeptic. It seems to me, as if like God's reasons for doing anything become like unknown. Like you're going to say, okay, well, I know God has to do the good, and I know the good is this. Therefore, like unless you just want to make a tautology to say I know what God's character is apart, just from Him, apart from being able to reason to it. But I feel like then that's going to make any kind of inference very difficult unless you just have, since we can't directly observe God in that way to know His properties. If you're going to infer it rationally, then you're presupposing that there's a rational basis that God has to conform to, and that's the same with God's ethical decisions.
So I just don't see any way for this argument to. I mean, this is really like a moral argument, but like kind of like the weird twist to it.
Yeah. Look, I'll give him the fact that I think I'm glad that he did something different than the Kalam or something. But I feel like this is a really weird one to start off a debate with, especially like given, I don't know, I mean, this isn't really made for a popular level audience, but I feel like there's a lot more that could have been fleshed out here if he was going to go down that route. So I feel like the arguments he does choose are very strange, and I think there's a lot of strong ones. Again, I know he wanted to do something different, and it wasn't. And he has certain specializations, but this is not what I would have gone with if I was doing the opening.
Setting the existence of evil aside, note that in order to even answer tonight's debate question, we must assume that knowledge and rationality exist. Hence, my second argument.
Yeah, here we go.
Is this the EAAN?
I think he is. I think he's
doing that. Here we go, man. Here we go. Let's go with the favorite argument. Yeah.
Atheism is true. The knowledge and rationality would not exist. 2, some atheists, such as Justin, have used their knowledge and rationality to become atheists. Therefore, knowledge and rationality exist, and therefore, atheism is false. This would mean that to even answer tonight's question, God must exist. By way of preliminary remarks, knowledge is at minimum a justified or warranted true belief. Think of this like ingredients in a cake. If you're missing one ingredient, you can't have knowledge.
Okay, so I'll grant him this just for the sake of argument, but at least most epistemologists don't hold to the the JTB view of knowledge, because I don't think there are any necessary or sufficient conditions that apply to all knowledge claims, given the Gettier problem. So I'll be a little bit more hesitant I'll grant it just for the sake of argument, but I just want to point that out.
I have not read enough contemporary epistemology to have an opinion.
But like at least most contemporary epistemologists don't think that there's any like necessary or sufficient conditions, because you can always come up with counterexamples. And so I think that knowledge, at least my view of this, is that knowledge is just evidence. And that it might be different depending on the situation.
I have heard that if you say the word contemporary epistemology 3 times in a row, David Paulman just sporadically appears into a stream. So they may end up happening with me. Yeah.
Very true. Yeah.
To illustrate, suppose you wake up from a nap and you see that the microwave reads 12 o'clock. And on that basis, you form the belief that it is 12 o'clock. But then you feel that it's hot in your house, there's water under the fridge, and you notice that the microwave is actually blinking 12 o'clock. And thus, you conclude that the power must have gone out. Now, the question is it 12 o'clock? Well, you don't know. As they say, a broken clock is still right twice a day. But the point here is that if your belief that it is 12 o'clock is based solely on the reading of the microwave, and given that the power has gone out, then you now have what's called an undercutting defeater for trusting in the reliability of the microwave. And this would equally remove all rational justification for trusting in the validity and truth of any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave.
Okay, yeah, it would undercut that belief, because your evidence would be, defeated or say screened off, right?
In fairness, I know it's an analogy. Analogies aren't perfect, but there's another way that you could at least have a defeater for 12 o'clock, which is called going outside of your house and looking at the sky. How people do the sort of thing. I mean, you wouldn't know the exact time, but you could at least know it's not 12 a.m. in the morning if it's clearly afternoon. So there's at least some ways you could still find a defeater. But even if it was like just the case that you couldn't for whatever reason, like even granting that, I don't disagree with that in principle, even though it takes an externalist view of epistemology. But I think we can grant. I'm okay with granting that.
Yeah.
But I think that the first premise, and just in fairness, Justin does respond to this at some point in the debate. I forget when. And I think it's fair, is I don't think the premise that we wouldn't have or wouldn't likely have warranted in rationality under atheism is a very, I don't think there's much evidence for that. Now, I do think that, well, I probably should hold off on this in terms of.
No, hold it off. Yeah.
I'll hold off on this until we get to more, but.
No problem.
In the same way, if there was no God, then a similar problem arises on atheism with respect to knowledge and rationality for at least two reasons, all of which have to do with the reliability of our cognitive faculties, and for the sake of simplicity, we can just say the brain. First, if there is no God, then our brains were not designed to obtain truth, and this is obvious given that on atheism there is no designer. And second, if there is no God, then our cognitive faculties, given natural selection, at best would only aim at survival value and not truth.
Okay, so this assumes an externalist theory of
right.
how we gain knowledge, right? Because if you hold to an eternalist view, then this argument completely gets like undercut. Because you wouldn't need reliable cognitive faculties in order to have knowledge on an eternalist view. Now, of course, you would on an externalist view, but
but could that still be a defeater for, like, if you were to find out that you had like Alzheimer's and you originally had certain beliefs, if someone came up to you and then told you later, oh, that didn't happen, you misremember that given your Alzheimer's, should you then change your belief and say, oh, maybe I was wrong?
So the critical difference here is that you can make that argument, but the externalist wants to say, though, is that all knowledge is dependent upon our cognitive faculties, and the eternalist would deny that assumption. Like,
sure, I think you can say some knowledge, yeah, but
yeah,
if it's all knowledge, sure, I think that's fine. But yeah, and that's fair because he's making Eric is making a very bold claim here about like they cannot have any rationality, and that's very
that's just not
as a Bayesian, even planning it as a Bayesian argument for belief in naturalism, right? That like it's unlikely. He doesn't say it like it is, but I think Eric's trying to make an even stronger argument here. Another thing is, again, I swear, every time that Eric says or implies teleology design, this was a drinking game, which we won't do because we're good Christians. We'll use grape juice. We would, this would be over really quickly, but this kind of goes back to the whole blind watchmaker thing. Like, yes, evolution doesn't have a designer in the sense that he's implying it, but given that these are not just pure chance and that there is a form of selection that is selecting for advantageous traits, it's not as if it's just a random number generator. Any belief is equally going to come up, right?
Yeah.
You have beliefs being selected and canceled out. Now, his second point, which is a little bit better, is that would these correspond to truth? Because they would correspond to survival, which is being selected for, but are they true? And some people, and Justin will say this too, and we can hold off till he gets his rebuttal, but like that short version is that, well, maybe having actually, I'll wait till he gets to his example before I say that. Yeah.
Truth value. In other words, if our beliefs and behaviors play any role in this evolutionary process, then natural selection is going to select for beliefs that produce adaptive behavior and grant survival value. Consequently, this would mean that natural selection wouldn't care whether or not your beliefs are true, but merely that your beliefs help you to adapt and survive. To give an example of this, suppose a car is coming towards me, and I form the belief that in order to survive, I must jump out of the way. So I do that, and natural selection sees that these beliefs produce adaptive behavior and says, check, let's go ahead and pass those on, given that these beliefs produce and granted survival value. But note that if a false set of beliefs could equally work and grant survival value, then your beliefs don't have to be true for them to be passed on given natural selection. To illustrate, take the same scenario, but imagine a different set of beliefs. A car is coming towards me, but I have the belief that I'm Superman, and if a car hits me, I won't die. However, because I want to protect my identity as Clark Kent and don't want people to know I'm Superman, so in order to do that, I jump out of the way to appear human and conceal my identity, which means that these false set of beliefs could still produce the same type of adaptive behavior and survival value. And again, natural selection wouldn't care if your beliefs are true. Now, I say that to say, just as there is an undercutting to fear for trusting in the reliability of the microwave, which would further remove all rational justification for the validity and truth of any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave, then in the same way, if there is no God, then you now have an undercutting to fear for trusting in the rational reliability of your brain, which further removes all rational justification for trusting in the validity and truth of any belief your brain produces. And thus, if atheism is true, and Justin's brain has produced in him the belief that there is no God, then it becomes a belief that is undercut by this type of defeater, and thus he shouldn't trust or believe it.
I'm wondering if... Okay, so let's grant everything. I'm still confused on how this, because like I feel like not all atheists are naturalists, right? So like even if I grant the evolutionary argument against naturalism, it still seems like this wouldn't necessarily like cut against atheism.
He's also I think Justin's a panpsychist, if I remember correctly. So
I think, yeah.
I don't know if that. I think this also would primarily work if you're like a dualist, or I'm sorry, not a dual. If you're a physicalist,
Yeah, physicalist, yeah.
have what word like like as we said, externalism. But I don't think that even. So I think that the critique of here that's usually given, and Justin doesn't at this point, is that the problem is that you're not just looking at individual beliefs as if they're independent beliefs. Like planning as one is like tiger, caveman sees it and he runs away because he thinks it's a witch, and he thinks that, and so his belief that the tiger is a witch is false, and the running away is going to make him survive. But the problem is having a consistent worldview overall is going to matter in the long run. So yeah, maybe the Superman person gets lucky this time, but the problem is that he thinks he's Superman, and that affects other beliefs, which it should. That's going to have other consequences. So if you dodge a card and you think you're Superman, that's great. But then if you believe in Superman and says, "Oh, I'm Superman, I therefore must be able to fly," and you jump off a cliff, it's not going to be as beneficial to that. So you have to have it's a consistent set of beliefs. It's not just an individual belief. It needs to be other entailments of, well, if this is true with my worldview, then other things should be true. So you can't separate one belief from the other. And so therefore having a generally accurate map of your environment is more advantageous than having a false one. Because even if you have certain individual beliefs that are advantageous, it's not going to be advantageous in the long run. So that's typically the critique with the EAAN. But I will say, I think that one can concede that and say, yes, the EAAN doesn't work, and evolution will generally give us a pretty accurate view of our environment. But I would pull that on and say, if that is the case, the fact that evolution has preserved so strongly religious experience and intuition towards the spiritual, which the vast majority of people have always had and still have, unless we have a good defeater for that, why not think that evolution has preserved this, because it's not only good for survival, but because it is in fact true, unless we have a defeater for it.
Yeah.
So, and if they want to then say, well, this is a win and it's preserved because it helped us survive, but then they're going to concede, oh, wait a minute. So you are saying that evolution can preserve on a large scale beliefs that are false and yet that are still advantageous without an obvious defeater, and that's something we could debate, and yet not correct it. And so then if they're going to concede that, then the EAAN may actually come back into force. But in order for them to deny that, they're going to have to deny religious experience. So that's, to me, that's my evolutionary dilemma against naturalism, which I think is a stronger form than planning as original version or Eric's here. But that's what I would have done.
Yeah. Very true.
Moreover, if knowledge is at minimum a justified true belief, and if given naturalism, you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces, then rational justification for trusting in the truth of your beliefs becomes unjustified, and without these ingredients, knowledge becomes impossible. Hence, my argument that if atheists like Justin have used their knowledge and rationality to become atheists, then knowledge and rationality exist, and therefore atheism is false. And once again, if atheism is false, then theism is true, and God does exist. Now, even if Justin could overcome this problem, which I don't think is possible, answering tonight's question assumes the existence of consciousness.
Oh, that's a pretty strong claim. Damn. It's not possible to overcome this problem.
He's going to have to use his reason to overcome it, which means he's just conceding the argument.
It's not possible to overcome the argument. That's pretty strong. I'm not going to lie. That was.
I win because it's impossible for you to overcome my argument.
Damn.
No one has ever even addressed this argument.
Yeah.
That sounds like a precept, honestly. I'm not saying Eric is one, but that terminology is sounding like when you say when you have that.
Although maybe it's just his rhetoric. I don't know, but yeah, it's a pretty strong claim.
You could have at least done a Bayesian version where you say it's less likely that you'll have reason, but you say that it's like a logical impossibility is where it's quite. Now maybe he's being hyperbolic, and that's fair, but still,
whatever.
And implicitly libertarian free will. Hence, my final argument from the existence of the soul. Premise 1: if atheism is true, then given naturalism, souls, i.e., immaterial substances and properties, would not exist. If souls do not exist, then consciousness and free will would not exist. In support of premise 1, as philosopher J.P. Moreland argues in his book, Consciousness and the Existence of God, he says, the naturalist epistemology and grand story...
He just equivocated atheism with naturalism.
Yeah. Because, no, he did. Because Moreland is...
He said atheism in his premise, and then he directly said that. Which even naturalists, I think, can be panpsychists, right?
No, yeah. No, yeah, definitely.
or,
I know,
or like even pantheists technically.
I know for
Or
a fact that Bernardo
transcendentalists.
Kastrup, he's an idealist. Well, I don't know if he would call himself an atheist, but he's definitely like born that camp. And then you have F.H. Bradley, which was also, and then I think Skellen, I forgot his name, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of atheists that could like believe in souls and like stuff, right? So yeah, it just seems very weird that like Eric keeps on equivocating between like naturalism and atheism.
Mhm.
Now, of
Yeah.
course, like
In fairness, I
naturalism,
think there are critiques. I mean, I have my own issues with pantheism and panpsychism and all the other like alter. So
yeah,
you could nitpick with that, and I think that's an argument. But I don't. I mean, I'm not a panpsychist. I'm
yeah,
probably more in the. Granted, I just don't. I haven't looked into idealism, but I think substance dualism to me is where I'm most comfortable right now, which I know some people think is really lame, but I'll still go with it. But yeah, but his arguments are for free will and the soul existing, and I think he's about to cite J.P. Moreland, so you can see where he goes with that.
Constrain the naturalist ontology and justify strong naturalism and a rejection of emergent entities. Many naturalists who keep a steady eye on broader epistemological and metaphysical issues reach the same conclusion. And he points out how for the agnostic philosopher Frank Jackson, he states that if naturalism is to have superior explanatory power, then this entails strong naturalism. Summarizing the sentiment, atheist philosopher of mind Paul Churchland remarks, the important point about the standard evolutionary story is that the human species and all
I think the reason why he's using this argument is because Eric does study the philosophy of mind. So that is that's like his bread and butter.
This is his area where
So
he's
yeah,
comfortable.
fair enough.
its features are wholly the physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is a correct account of our origins, he continues, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical accounts of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, and we should learn to live with that fact. Regarding premise 2, consciousness and free will ontologically require a soul in order to exist or be possible.
Well, no, that's actually not true because like I know David Chalmers, he accepts like that consciousness is irreducible, but like he's not a substance dualist, so like you don't have to accept the soul.
Again, is Eric like equivocating maybe on, and I know Eric knows better because this is his area, but it's maybe just to his audience, he's not being as clear as he could be.
Here's a book
when he
called
says soul,
The Neural. Caleb, go ahead.
You want me to go ahead, or you want to say your point?
No, I was gonna say. So I have a book called The Neural Basis of Free Will by Peter Ticey. He is not a substance dualist; he's a physicalist, and he argues that we have free will. So it's like
libertarian free will, or is he
yes,
compatibilist?
no, like literally like libertarian free will. So
is that like quantum indeterminacy in the brain, kind of what he's appealing to? Or
since I read the book, but he thinks that the brain like has its own mechanism. It's kind of weird, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I actually do agree that I think libertarian free will is best explained by some kind of soul, because I think even if you take, I mean, there's, you have the event causation and agent causation. Even if you take event causation isn't indeterministic, which you can, I do think that has issues with like being partialism and like it's part of you, but it's not you yourself. And so it's kind of a chance objection. But that's kind of its own thing. But I do think that Eric is being a little unintentional. I'm not accusing him like intentionally doing this. I think a little sloppy with some of the words he's using. Is in when he says soul and he's not really defining it for the audience. Does he mean like a Cartesian substance dualism, or does he mean
homomorphism? Yeah.
Does he mean any kind of consciousness that's like not physical? So are we including idealism, or are we like even panpsychism? Like, is he including just anything that's not physicalism, or like emergentism? Like, is that, because I feel like that's where it gets, because if you hold to those other models, then you could say consciousness is possible without the kind of soul that he's talking about, unless he's just talking about physicalism. But which I would agree. But I think there's so many better. It's weird to me that he can be so well read in this, but like I think that the qualia arguments, or the persistence of personal identity thought experiments, those to me are so much more interesting and compelling, and the exclusivity of first person experience. I think all that's more compelling than appeals to free will and other stuff. So I think he should have hammered that home, and I guess like I don't think consciousness is a bad argument, but I feel like the way he's presenting it makes it much weaker than it could have been.
Yep. Yeah, because I mean I agree with I think arguments from consciousness are really good in terms of arguments for theism, but like Eric's version of this argument is like not very good at
And you
all.
can, I mean, like even if one it does hold to kind of a pantheist view, like if you're going to say that consciousness is immaterial, or at least is not like, well, panpsychists wouldn't agree with that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, isn't in the physicalist sense, isn't like just emergent from a combination of certain properties? That is more predicted under theism, because theism entails there's at least one necessarily existing disembodied mind, right?
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say this. Yeah, okay. Like classical theism does. We're not including pantheism, because pantheism includes the existence of both at the same time. But if you have at least one, you know, if you're going to concede that mind is more irreducible and is not contingent on matter, that is better entailed under theism than naturalism. And that's why the naturalists uses the opposite argument to say, well, you know, the fact that we have physical minds is evidence against theism. So, I do agree that it's relevant. It doesn't prove it, but it is evidence on either side. But you know, we have to just see. But it's not so much big. So,
with the nature of consciousness, I submit to you that it must be immaterial, given that its existence cannot be identical nor reducible to the physical.
Okay, but just because consciousness is irreducible does not mean that it's immaterial. Like, I think a panpsychist would definitely like disagree with that. So yeah, but anyways.
And this is easily demonstrated via Leibniz's law of identity. For example, my thoughts can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought of this debate doesn't weigh 3 pounds. A taste of banana can measure a state of my brain can measure 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana can't be 7 inches long. Hence, if consciousness exists, it cannot be identical nor reducible to the physical. Concerning free will, and more specifically libertarian free will, this can be defined.
Yeah. I think so much of this, in the way that he presented it, seems like it's begging the question in terms of like, if you say, well, love is not reducible to material, people could say dopamine. Like if you were a physicalist, you would say all of these things: smelling a rose, taste banana. We can go in and see exactly where the chemicals go at what point, and we can stimulate that in your brain without even doing it. Now I agree that that's not going to explain it, but I think if I was just watching this presentation, I would think that he was just begging the question there in terms of like he's assuming that this is like a platonic, like the concept of a rose's smell without being reduced to that, right? And I get it, like the first person experience, I can see your brain through an MRI or whatever, let's say, sniffing a rose, and I can know what that is. But it is true that I can't know, if I've never smelled a rose and you have, I can't know what that's like. I can see that you're doing it, but I can't experience it because that's impossible. I can't share a consciousness with someone. So that is a better way of saying it, appealing to qualia, but I don't think that was very clearly stated in the way that he presented that.
All right.
As being the first mover of one's will or actions. That is to say, you are not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. However, if naturalism is true, then as secular philosopher Jaegwon Kim argues, the causal closure of the physical must be true. According to this law, no physical event has a non-physical cause. Consequently, this would mean that on atheism, every thought, decision, belief, and behavior was causally determined by physical events external to and beyond one's control. Put differently, this would mean that Justin's very decision to become an atheist was not the result of rigorous research and freely following the evidence where it led and freely coming to his own conclusion, but rather it was something he was causally determined to believe by prior non-rational factors beyond his control, and he could not have believed otherwise.
See, I think Eric needs to read Peter Dicey's book. So,
well, funny. I think just from my layman's knowledge of it, I do think that having even a libertarian view in physicalism would be problematic, because I agree with his definition. I think that free will is best explained if it's the first person mover.
Well, you don't need to be a physicalist and a determinist is the thing. So like you can
still I agree with that. You can be an indeterminist, although I do think that physical models of indeterminism are problematic, because I think you're basically saying that like the certain particles that are indeterministic, I think those are external to you. I don't think they are you. I mean, they make up you, but they're a part of you. They're not the same thing as you as a whole. So there, I would say that you're not really the first mover. Only a part of you is. But even putting like that aside, I feel like this is the exact same issue he just did with the EAAN, where he's saying it's not rational. You're determined to believe everything, and so therefore you can't trust your own thoughts. Where it's like, well, if your brain is being preserved and through natural selection, which is aimed at a truth-making environment, then why is that relevant to whether my thoughts are true or not? Like, why can it not be causally determined based on the environment I'm in and I'm surviving in it, and that also be true? Like, I think he just is, again, he's acting like it's determined, therefore it can't be rational. I don't see that following at all.
As with the previous argument, this presents an undercutting defeater for knowledge, rationality, and now, without the existence of the soul, no consciousness, no free will, and consequently, no foundation for moral responsibility or intellectual integrity for any belief he holds to. Thus, if Justin made a conscious free decision to become an atheist, then consciousness and free will exist, therefore souls exist, therefore atheism is false. And as before, once again, if atheism is false, then theism is true and God does exist.
So the first argument relies upon, it's just a different moral argument. Second argument relies upon epistemic externalism, and equates, and then the third argument just equates naturalism with atheism. So yeah, that's his entire case.
That's a short version. And you know what's funny? All these three, I think you can tell that Eric really likes to do arguments where it's like, ooh, I'm going to say that if you're an atheist, it's a circular argument, and therefore this is like almost a quasi Frank Church view of you're stealing from God. Atheism requires you to be actually a theist and not know it. Like rationality and ethics, like you think evil exists. Well, guess what? Evil can't exist unless God exists. Like that's kind of you could tell that he was in his hotel room, like rubbing his hands together. No, I'm kidding, by the way, in case Eric ever sees this. I'm not really not trying to be mean, and I get it. Like we all love a good look. I already gave my religious epistemology argument, like Philip Megan's naturalism, that I like, that does try to do that. We all like a good hand wringing of, aha, I'm going to turn an Uno reverse card on you and hurt you with your own argument. Like it's fun. I get it.
Yeah.
But I don't think that always works, and I think you'd be careful when you do that and make sure it's actually a sound argument. And I think that even if you're not an atheist, as we are not, you can find faults in these arguments and improve upon them. I think that 2 out of these 3, actually, no, all 3. I think all 3 have ways they could have been better. Moral argument, you could have done an epistemology argument. Existence of knowledge, rationality, already said.
Religious experience,
make it a dilemma, existence of the soul, make it where transcendent minds are more entailed in atheism and naturalism. There are ways these could have been better and improved. So this is not just a blatant, tearing these apart. This is constructive criticism. Like you do have something there, but this really could have been stretched out a lot more.
Yeah. Are you ready to go into Justin's opening statement?
Yep.
Because now we're gonna have to go after him.
Now, in conclusion,
I'm putting a charger
irony of my.
I'm putting a charger in because my laptop's right there. So I'm listening. I'm going to turn my camera off for like 5 seconds.
What the hell? Okay.
Entire case for answering tonight's question. And just in case this implicit point hasn't been made clear, allow me to make it explicit. Suppose Justin uses an argument from the existence of evil against the existence of God, and you, the audience member, agree with him. And then, using your knowledge and rationality to freely follow the evidence that he presents, find yourself with the conscious belief that Justin is correct, then it would follow that evil, knowledge and rationality, consciousness, and free will, which ontologically require a soul to ground them, must exist, and thus, given my arguments, it would follow that atheism is false and God does exist. So ironically, even if you're convinced that Justin has won this debate by the end of the night, then it would only mean that atheism is false, theism is true, and
wow.
You just did what I said.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I mean, this is. I don't know. I haven't talked to Eric about this. I know Than has, so maybe, but like not about this, but just in general. But I'm curious if Eric thinks that, like, does he think that the existence of God is like logically certain, or would he even take a Bayesian approach? I feel like he's saying this is like logically entailed.
Yeah.
He didn't frame this to mind unless he wants to clarify. I don't think he framed this as a probability thing of like it's unlikely we'd have rationality. This sounds like a no. It's literally completely self-defeating. Like I don't even know if he would say that atheism is like even remotely plausible, which is a very strong point to take.
Yeah.
But we'll see. So
therefore, God must exist. Thank you.
All right, good evening. I'm delighted to be participating in tonight's debate. I consider it a real privilege to be having this dialogue with my new friend Eric. The question being, does God exist? I hold that God probably does not exist. Appropriately then, I've been asked to share with you some reasons for this, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. Like many of my fellow atheists, I am also a naturalist. A quick and dirty kind of definition of this is going to be one I like is by philosopher Luke Roelofs. According to this definition, naturalism is the view, naturalism is the view that the world contains a single basic type of stuff, whose behavior is governed by a single set of simple general laws, and that those laws are those revealed by science. Before diving into the evidence, I want to say a little bit about theory comparison. So all else being equal, there's good reason to prefer the worldview or theory that contains the fewer kinds of entities. Both naturalism and theism are committed to the basic type of stuff, as well as the laws that relate them. However, theism is committed to additional kinds or categories of basic agents, novel forms of causation, and basic powers.
Interesting. So there's different types of simplicity that could be employed here. But I would actually say that this is actually not necessarily true, given so obviously I think most forms of theism that theists are committed to, so like a supernaturalist theism, I would probably agree with Justin here, but not all types of theisms use the same. So like, for example, I hold to a trope theory view of theism where God is one entity with zero properties and zero kinds, so there is no category on a kind of trope theory of metaphysics. So I think this is highly dependent upon, number one, it's highly dependent upon what metaphysical view of theism do you hold to. It's dependent upon different variations of simplicity. Number three, I think, like, okay, even if we grant this argument, that doesn't necessarily mean that naturalism is more probable just because it's simpler. Like, simplicity is not by itself relevant for increasing the probability of a hypothesis. You're going to need more than simplicity if you want to increase the probability. And this applies not just to probability in general, but even intrinsic probability. So consider this example. So like, let's say we take a fair coin, we flip it 8 times, and there's 8 different possible state descriptions. You have the first 4 state descriptions are fair coins, so there's a 50-50 chance either way. And then, of course, the other 4 are just unfair coins. Now, obviously, I think we can all agree that the first 4 flips are going to have an equal probability, right? But on plausible views of simplicity, you could say, well, if you have, like, let's say you have 2 heads and then 2 tails, right, on both flips. We could say as well, it's more simple to posit one kind of thing, in this case, 2 heads, rather than a head and a tail. But obviously, it'd be absurd to say, oh, well, the 2 heads is more probable than a head and a tail. Like, no, they're equally probable, because they're both flipped by the same fair coin, right? And that just shows you that, like, simplicity might play a role and increase the probability of hypotheses, but it's not going to be simplicity by itself. You're going to need something more than that. So I'm not sure if what Justin here is doing is implying that you're going to increase the probability of naturalism just because it's simpler. But if you're going to go that route, so even if I granted him his argument, it seems like, no, you can provide counterexamples to show that it wouldn't increase the probability of one's hypothesis just because it's simpler. We have
like I think it's, would you say prima facie, if all else was equal, it would be better if it was simpler, like assuming that we didn't have any other arguments, it was
I mean,
purely
yeah, but then you would have to argue that theism and naturalism are equally have like exactly equal
I agree
explanatory
that
power. But like, I don't think you're ever gonna like reach that point in a debate. Like,
right.
I think,
No, I agree
I
with
think
that. And
both the naturalists and the theists are gonna like have big disagreements about which theory has the most explanatory power. So yeah, all else being equal, sure, the simpler theory is probably the most correct one. But that's like way down the line. That's like way down. Like,
all else being equal is a definite like hold up on that. But I know I agree with you. I know I pushed back on him on 2 points. One, I don't even know if I would say that it is simpler, to be honest. And I mean that in terms of like, if you were to tell an idealist or Descartes that naturalism is simpler, they'd be like, excuse me, like I know I exist. I don't know that like I'm more confident in my existence in the natural world. So why on earth would I say that I should only think the natural world exists, right? Like, so I think that,
Justin is agreeing with my point, so that's good. We're on common ground.
Oh, I didn't even know Justin was watching this.
Yeah, he is.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And then of course I think the second issue, even if I were to grant that it was simpler, is that simplicity gets you into problems with like where you stop in causation, right? Like if you're going to say we only want to posit contingent things, then you're going to have an issue with the ultimate explanation, right? If you want to say, well, so it kind of entails that there's both contingent and necessary things, if you're going to say that both of those are both contingent and necessary things are both natural, then how you begin to tell them apart is going to be very difficult in distinguishing that. So that almost entails that you have to likely to have a natural thing that is ontologically distinct from a contingent things, right? And so that would be one point. Plus, I think the ontology, just defining what is nature, like, what does that even mean? Like, can you describe nature in and of itself without appealing to?
Well, another thing that this is kind of, and I think Justin would agree with this, but like a lot of times in science, we do have to posit new entities, right?
Yeah.
So like positing an additional entity is not necessarily going to decrease probability, right? So I think it just depends on the context, but yeah. Anyways, let's continue.
Now, if that's right, one thing that naturalism has in its favor, at least at this stage, is its qualitative simplicity. And now for my evidence for naturalism. Evolutionary evils experienced by sentient beings who are not moral agents. In River Out of Eden, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins writes, "The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there ever is a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored." For millions upon millions of years then, this predation, parasitism, and privation have been the rule rather than the exception. This is the ultimate Hunger Games scenario. My argument starts with the fact that there are sentient beings and that some of them are not moral agents, and asks which theory best explains the fact that the non-moral agent variety has experienced these evolutionary evils as deeply and for as long as they in fact have. Now, if naturalism is true, any life that exists will be biologically embodied. By that I mean that they will be relatively fragile, metabolic, organic systems dependent upon their environment. As populations become isolated...
So,
This is his best argument.
Yeah, that's his best argument. Yeah, I'm not gonna So there's a lot I'm gonna have him continue because I do have a lot to say. But let me.
Let him finish that point, because I actually do think this is probably one of the strongest arguments for naturalism. So I think that should be given some.
We'd expect differing evolutionary strategies to develop. Notably, on naturalism, there's not going to be any moral constraints on the strategies that they might develop. However, if theism is true, the very concept of life is going to be much more broad. After all, omnipotence is not limited to crafting biological forms of life. Any conceivable object, natural or supernatural, can be created and imbued with mentality and basic powers to act and to interact with each other and with the environment. God was not limited to the orchestration of these mortal metabolisms that endlessly struggle for finite resources, nor was it a necessary truth that the resources over which they struggle include, for some designs, the very flesh of others. There was always a vegetarian option, and the fact that the Creator did not avail itself of that option surely counts against its goodness. Now, if God exists, there appears to be a deep coincidence here. God just so happened to create life that was, one, biologically embodied, and two, by way of an apparently morally blind evolutionary process. These both had to be the case if naturalism is true, but of course, neither had to be the case if theism is true.
So, I would this is probably where me and Justin would have our big disagreement, at least in terms of what naturalism entails. I don't think that naturalism entails something like evolution. So like, it might entail, like, if we're talking like life as we know it, I guess the issue is it depends on how. So I'm going to go by his definition of naturalism earlier. So I'm not assuming, because for me, like, how I understand naturalism is like basically like an indifferent process, right? And so because it's morally indifferent, it's not going to be more likely to produce one outcome over another. Now, you could say, well, I'm just going to assume some laws of nature, right? But I'm not even sure if that would necessarily follow, because naturalists, like, especially when it comes to like fine-tuning arguments, they always want to point out like, hey, we have these anthropic principles to point out all these different ways in which life could come about, right? Which if that's the case, then like, okay, yeah, that might be that's probably correct. But like, that's not more likely that life would come about through evolution than that it could just spontaneously appear, right?
You're
And
saying
then
that the laws of nature could be in such a way that that it would be like fine tuned essentially to bring life forward without.
yeah, without evolution, and not only that, but like, I mean, consider like, if we're talking about a system of blind chance, like if there is no, if we're talking like naturalism as the hypothesis of indifference, like if that's what we mean by the term, it seems to me like it's just going to be kind of like, how are you going to make any kind of predictions about what naturalism entails, right?
Right.
Now, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, I think we're going to need auxiliary hypotheses to make predictions. I mean, both theism and naturalism do. The key difference, though, is that for naturalism, it's 100% random. So whenever you use an auxiliary hypothesis, like, okay, I assume like orderly laws of nature or something. Well, it's like, okay, well, there's so much built into that that it's like, how is this more likely on naturalism? Now, maybe Justin takes a view that like suffering is more likely on naturalism. That's a different argument. But at least here, in terms of how life can come about, it's not all clear to me. Like, why did it have to be in the evolutionary sense? Why couldn't it have been spontaneously appeared? Like, I mean, think about it like this. Like, let's say there's laws of nature where life does have to come about spontaneously. Like, how is that less likely on naturalism, right? If you get what I mean.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see what you're saying, and I think that they would say that like adding in auxiliary hypotheses, like given the laws of nature that currently exist, right?
Yeah.
That life is extremely unlikely, and that if it is, and so I mean, you're kind of implying that sentence like of, if God's going to make a world of value, then He's going to make preferably embodied creatures who can morally develop, and that's why you have that. And so you'd expect any world of theism that God creates is going to have those, whereas naturalism, it may have those, it may not. There's no reason why it favors
Well, the thing with theism, though, is that for theism, there's a probability of one that God will do a best action, where there is one, no bad
if it's
actions.
logically entailed, or at least it's high. Yeah.
I would say it's logically entailed that God would at least, so there's kind of three things. Number one, there's a probability one that God would do a best action where there is one, a very good action, and no bad action. Okay, that is just like logically entailed from theism.
Right.
So you're going to have a direction, right? Just from the hypothesis alone. Now, of course, if you want to explain phenomena, you're going to have to add in auxiliaries, right? But that's fine, because the only auxiliaries we have to include are going to be moral auxiliaries or axiological auxiliaries. Like, it's valuable for there to be embodied life, for example. Whereas for naturalism, it's like, okay, well, you start off naturalism, there's a random process, right? So you start off with a morally indifferent process that's no more likely to produce any other outcome over another. Once you add in auxiliaries to that hypothesis, that's where I think weighted averages would come into play, because it's like,
I agree that in principle the existence of just conscious agents is far more likely under theism. So that is a fair point. But I think what Justin's saying, if it were the like, he might grant, yes, it's unlikely under naturalism you get life in that way. But if it were the case, you wouldn't expect it to be, first of all, like if God wants to, and actually I'll save the second point because it's in his next argument when he talks about argument scale. But in this argument, he's saying if it were the case that God were to create agents to do good, maybe suffering will help develop morals, but you wouldn't expect that with animals who are non-moral agents that they would needlessly suffer. That makes more sense under indifference than it does under theism, which I do agree with. Now, I would respond by saying that I think it goes both ways. On the one hand, I think that is it Michael Murray who has his book, The Nature, Red Blood, Tooth and Claw? I think that's the name.
Michael Murray. No, I think God Without Ethics or something. Or
no, and it's a particular book, I think, by Oxford. I forget. I think it's something like Michael.
Yeah.
It starts with an M. But he argues that, like, he basically says that most animals can't feel pain neurologically or whatever. And of course, you could debate the soul, what role that plays in there. But even assuming that's true, I think we agree that's true for like lower animals, like for like certain insects and maybe fish. Like they can't feel it. But of course, that's not true for higher animals like apes or dogs or horses. Is my claim.
So
Given that life exists, so he's adding on auxiliary hypothesis.
Auxiliary. Okay. Yes. So probability, evolution, life, and is high given my claim, given that life exists. Yes. But I think the point here is that the theist can do the same thing, especially if your auxiliary on theism is going to be if it's going to be a value claim. So like if you're going to say that embodied life is a valuable thing, like just independently, like intrinsically valuable, and so in the probability that God would do that action is 1, right? Then evolution is going to be like highly probable, at least when we do the comparison, right? So I think both the naturalist and the theist in this case are going to need auxiliaries. That's not the disagreement. The disagreement is about what happens when we add those auxiliaries.
Yeah,
basically.
But he's saying that I think he could concede theism has a higher prior probability in this case, but the posterior probability, you'd expect theism to bring about life, but you wouldn't expect it to be over evolution if that it requires a lot of suffering that doesn't lead to any kind of moral development that seems needless and gratuitous. That he's saying that is the posterior. Like, yes, we can say that life's less likely, but it's not. If it were the case, it's far less.
So in that case, it's more like it is a Draperian way of argument.
Yes.
Because that's sort of what Draper does as well in his work. At least he does it in the pain and pleasure argument. He uses the same kind of format. But
anyway, what I was saying with the animal thing is that like I think that suffering for animals that don't have like overly developed neural systems isn't as problematic, and for suffering of animals that do, like apes and horses and dogs, right, that are more intelligent, it is bad suffering. But I think that they actually do have some kind of moral agency, especially like given an afterlife and given soul making. So I think if you say animals are very different from us and can't morally develop, then suffering isn't that bad, given that they probably can't, feel pain in the same way that we can. And if they can feel pain and really do suffer as we do, then I think there's a high chance that they are moral agents. And in fact, you do see altruistic behavior in, again, more intelligent species. And so I do think that you can, in the fact, there are studies that even show that like animals like dogs can have PTSD. And so I think you can make an inferential argument. You can say, given that we know soul making happens when people have, this level of cognizance and this level of memory and this level of being able to overcome trauma, the fact that we do observe similar levels of trauma and suffering in certain animals makes us be able to infer that these animals may also be able to develop in the afterlife moral properties that do in fact lead to a good thing, which is sort of what Trent Doherty argues to an extent. And Eric does appeal to Trent, in fairness, in his rebuttal.
Yeah.
So that's how I would say it.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there's a lot more that could be said just because this is like the strongest. It would be kind of like, what do you think is it'd be like trying to like present like, let's say like Joshua Rasmussen's argument from contingency in like a debate. Like it's going to take some time to respond to something like that.
By the way, Justin, if he's still watching after we're done with this, if you want to like, after when we're in the chat, like after this is over streaming, if you want to send him a link and talk to him for a little bit, I wouldn't mind that. Now after the stream's over, not like live.
No, it's fine.
If you want to throw him a link like after this is over, if he's still there, if he liked it, just that way he can give his side and kind of do that if he wants.
All right.
What's more, because God is perfectly compassionate and is aware of the intrinsic badness of animal suffering, theists need to assert theodicies, wherein God's permitting the suffering and death of non-human agents for millions of years.
Yeah, that is true. So like, but I would say a theodicy really works as an explanation of why there's evil in the world, right? And I would actually say that theodicies themselves are really just subsets of. So like when we talk about theism as a grand theory, right? It's trying to explain all this different data, and theodicy is really just a subset of like specifically talking about like how does theism explain suffering in the world, right? So in some way you could say that like the explanatory power of theism is really itself a theodicy in a way, and at least in its general like structure, if that makes sense. But yeah, because that
right.
I think because I've been studying the probable for like 2 years now, and like that's pretty much the conclusion that I've come to is like a theodicy. Like, there's really no distinction between a theodicy and like the explanatory power of theism. Like, they're one and the same.
Well, it's all entailed. You have to make predictions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say I don't know if I forget if he appeals to this is just standard problems of evil, like with people and
Yeah.
not animals. But if he does, I would also just say that given my work on miracles, that's meant to be a counter to the problem of evil, in the fact that problem of evil says there are gratuitous or unexpected evils we see if there's a good God, right? And miracles say these are unexpected and surprising goods that arrive in a world of indifference and natural
Yeah.
law. So I think that they mirror each other and play with each other really well. And so I think
Yeah.
I'd like to see more theodicies addressing that in the future. But that's a topic for a different day.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Is morally good, all things considered. Naturalism has no need for such elaborations. For these reasons, evolutionary evils visited upon sentient beings who are not moral agents are more probable on naturalism than on theism. This fact thereby constitutes evidence favoring naturalism over theism. The second piece of evidence is the near universal hostility of the universe to the survival of sentient beings who are moral agents. Astronomer Phil Plait writes, "The universe is an incredibly hostile place for life. It cares not at all if we live or if we die. If a human were magically transported to any random spot in the cosmos, within seconds, he would die."
Okay, so this is the second argument. So one last thing I was going to say in regards to Lisa's first argument is that you can't go from a description of suffering to it being unjustified, or I guess you could say to it being a something that disconfirms theism, right? There's going to need to be more work done on the part of the atheists if they want to make that connection. Now, I think they can make that connection, right? But that's going to include that in order to make that connection, you're going to need some sort of axiological assumptions that is going to have to be a part of the argument. So that's the other thing I want to mention, at least in regards to the last argument. But so yeah, this argument's the hostility argument. It's pretty interesting because I think it assumes a little bit too much because let me continue to see what he has.
99.9999, I will lose count of those 9% of the time. If naturalism is true, the fact that moral agents exist entails that some physical location within the universe is life permitting. But given that there are many, many more ways given that there are many more ways for a given location to be incompatible with the survival of tragic, organic, highly environmentally dependent life forms than for it to be permitting of such.
Well, okay, so my response to this argument would basically be that it assumes that God is only interested in moral agents, and like God might have other aesthetic reasons to create a large universe. I mean, what do you think, Caleb?
So I think that if you're just going to say that God wants a world with lots of moral agents, then it is a decent argument to say, well, if that's
I agree. I agree.
If that's
so
God's main focus, then like the fact that we don't, you like if just on that prediction, I would say God would probably instantly make people in a world, and you'd have like heliocentrism, world would be center of everything, right? And it would be like
I agree.
obvious.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Caleb. So, if that was like
that was it.
If that was your theory, like you have God plus God wants moral agents, then yeah, like a big universe like ours would be strong evidence against that.
But the second point to come into that, though, I think that, and Swinburne says this, and I think I think Rob Coons also has like an argument for this as well. But it's not the part of the good of being a moral agent. Part of again, this is all entailed with the worldview. Part of the idea of soul making is the ability to learn and develop not just virtues, although that's a big part of it, but just knowledge in general. And so having a world in which you can discover and learn things about the past, right, and be able to do science basically is good. And the fact with this is that we live in a world which is, Rob Coons would say, is fine-tuned for discoverability, in that we are able to actually not, even though the world is 13.8 billion years old, we can trace that all the way back to the moment in time. We can discover that. We have the ability to do that. And if we had evolved a couple 100 million years earlier or later, the universe would have expanded so much out of our range to where we wouldn't be able to pick up lights on our telescopes. So the fact that we live in a world that, yes, is big and is very old, and for most of its history didn't seem to care about moral agents, is not independent of that, because we have the ability to take all this information in and learn about this and explore it. And so you could say that this is actually aimed towards us, right? You could say that God made an old and big universe so that we could discover it, so that we can know about this, and that if God had made us 5 seconds after creation, we'd say, okay, God made us, and that's like, there wouldn't be as much to learn. And so maybe that is it. I'm not saying that's highly probable, but I think the point is there's so much that there's so much speculation on both sides, and we really can't know, but that is a plausible answer. And if that's the case, then I don't think it's unlikely. I don't think it's like highly expected under theism, but I don't think it's like highly unexpected either, in that way. And yeah, so again, so like I think it's an interesting argument. I do think that it is partially argument for naturalism, but I think it's very weak given that God could have lots of plausible reasons that may be entailed with his idea.
So
It could be moral agents as well. I'm sorry, it could be aesthetic values as well. I'm a bit more skeptical of that because I don't think there's like objective beauty in certain things of space. Because you could say is God like Picasso or like Monet, or does God like Jackson Pollock with like paint splatters? Is God just like crazy atoms going everywhere, quantum madness? Does he like a little bit of chaos? Like,
well, I mean, we just want to. So, like, if you want to explain the data, I mean, I think the theist has a lot to go for, because all you really need to do is just update your axiological assumptions, and then you can explain something like this. So,
right.
And now another thing is, like, I think like that might be able to screen off that disconfirmation, but you're still gonna have, like, naturalists are still gonna have some portion of the outcome space there, right? So in some sense it is like evidence for naturalism, right? Even if it's not like a decisive like argument.
It is if it's in that it's entailed. Like, I think the probability of the big universe is higher under naturalism than it is under theism, but I don't think it's like significantly higher. So I mean, like, it is some evidence for it, but again, we're weighing evidence on both sides. And I think
not only that, but when we're making predictions about what theism predicts, like, in order to like generate a prediction, you have to include auxiliary hypotheses. Like, you can't get around that. So,
and it's plausible given what we already said with the entailments of like soul building and learning. And I will say, I think the probability of theism, of a universe centered towards morally embodied agents like us having large scales and large times, I think the probability of that is under theism is much higher than the probability of naturalism having any kind of sentient life at all. Like, in that way, any kind of embodied agents. I mean, so I think that if they're going to concede that, okay, that has a low prior, but this is a high posterior, I can concede that. But I don't think it doesn't overcome the prior.
Such life forms, we'd expect any permitting portion to be the extreme exception. And that's exactly what we see. The vast majority of the universe is hostile to such fragility. Now, if theism is true, this is somewhat surprising, right? So, for example,
this is not theism, though. This is like a value theory. This is like, I mean, yeah.
I like how it just says like inanimate stuff. Like, it's just everything.
Yeah, but I mean, but theism doesn't entail any of this. This is like an I mean, this is an axiological value theory that you're using to predict the data, right? Now, of course, if you do, I mean, you can do that, and I agree with Justin. Like, hey, if you're going to like have theism plus this, like right here, then yeah, obviously, like a large universe like ours is going to be evidence against that. But like, all the theist has to do is just change their value assumptions, and you don't like, it's not going to count against theism, right? So that's all I have to say in response, at least to this.
If you can change them without being ad hoc, if it's a
well, yeah. I mean, obviously, you don't want to like, but I think that's a much larger discussion. But yeah,
right.
So the inference I just outlined regarding the expectation of near universal hostility, recall that it was based on a premise of cosmic indifference to value, right? It's on naturalism. However, this fact renders on theism, the inference unavailable to the theist. Moreover, near universal hostility limits the highest form of physically instantiatable value in the world, or in any world in where it holds true. Now, that value being the value of biologically embodied moral agency, the highest form of value we know to exist in the universe.
Reverse axiological, yeah, that makes interesting.
Yeah, hold on, let me finish this point because I was curious where he was going with this.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, you're good.
The larger the portion of the physical world that is biological life permitting, the greater physical value potential that there is. Now, if that's true, a perfectly rational and value-oriented creator God is very unlikely to make the vast majority of the universe to be utterly hostile to that form of life.
Sure, if you assume that moral agency is like the only thing that God is interested in.
Well, even granting that, though, like,
yeah.
If you hold the eternal regeneration, which I think both of us do, like that God will be eternally creating more and more, I don't say that's a problem because at any given point t, God can always make an infinite number of more embodied agents that can do moral goods. Like the fact that I don't see it like if it's saying that we don't have more in this world right now because like God's going to make an infinite number anyway, it's just going to be added on. So I'm not sure why why the proportions are relevant. Plus, biblically, I mean, there's a new heavens and a new earth. It's not just us. I mean, yeah, it's part of it, but it's the animals, all of creation, heavens and earth. So I do think that our universe as a whole will be redeemed in that and be part of this sanctification. So I don't think it's as if this is just a giant splurge that just goes to waste and God only cares about this little dot.
Yeah,
I think all of it's part of the story of salvation.
Yeah.
In other words, on theism, we'd expect the physical portion of the created world to reflect, to some significant degree, a degree of bias toward, or at least a compatibility with, the highest form of physically instantiable value. Instead, we discover that the vast majority of the universe is not only...
Just a quick shout out. There's a book I'm reading called The Intrinsic Value of Everything, and it kind of talks a lot about at least this, like, whether everything is intrinsically valuable or not. And they do make the argument that, yeah, moral agency is like a higher value, but like, that's not really relevant once you consider like, the amount of, inedible stuff you have. So like particles.
I really want to go and write a review of that book and say this book was not valuable to me and therefore valuable. Therefore it's wrong.
Oh, very funny, Caleb. Oh man. All right, let's continue.
Only utterly devoid of the highest form of physically instantiable value, but it is positively incompatible.
Oh, another thing, I didn't mention this, but this is something that Tim Howard, I think, mentioned in response to at least the argument from Scale, which is that, I mean, yeah, right now the universe might be hospital to life, but like that doesn't mean that it's always going to be like that in the future. So like that's another thing we need to consider is like there might be some theodicy in the background when it comes to this that can actually like explain what's really going on. So yeah.
And again, at least according to the Bible under Christian theism, that's exactly what it says: of the entire heavens and earth will be redeemed. So I don't think I don't think either you or I think that the universe we have now is going to be just as big and as vast as empty in the hereafter.
Yeah. All right.
Compatible with its survival. And for these reasons, this staggering mismatch between the physical world as a whole and the highest form of physically instantiable value that we know of is significant evidence against theism and for naturalism.
I mean, it's evidence against like theism plus all the auxiliary assumptions you're using, but the theists can always update their assumptions and like it wouldn't then it wouldn't count against theism, right? So
gosh, Gregory Dawes is just putting this it's like, oh no, you're adding on all these auxiliary hypotheses. It's not as simple. Naturalism have to do that.
Yeah. No, naturalism has to do that too. So you can't get around it. But yeah.
Laughs and Oppie. Yeah.
Yep. Anyways.
Now, for many of us, looking back in time at the horrors of deep evolutionary time and looking up at the darkness, the scale, and the absolute emptiness of space constitutes a kind of irreligious experience of our own cosmic fragility and our insignificance. Now, this fact brings me to my last bit of evidence: non-resistant non-belief and its distribution. Theism posits a perfectly loving God. What seems clear about the concept of perfect love is that love is relational and self-giving. Perfect love spills over, pushing beyond mere benevolence and toward a desire to be personally related with another for its own sake. Loving persons will also desire meaningful, explicit relationships with those they love because of the various ways in which those involved may stand to benefit from such a relationship. And this means that God, being perfectly loving, will always be open to a relationship with his loved ones, such that they can enter into a relationship with God just by trying. Now, because of this, and because it is a very good thing for people that they come to believe and identify themselves as one, that they are created by a loving God, and two, that their infinite creator is open to relationship with their finite selves, God will meet his loved ones with the provision of causally sufficient reasons for belief in him. Anything less would fail to be perfect love. To highlight this, philosopher J.L. Schellenberg insightfully asks, how could God, at some point, count as loving John or Joan as fully and as richly as God can, if at that time John or Joan, or at that time God, I'm going to start over. How could God at some time count as loving?
I'll give him that. It's a really hard quote to read. Oh man. All right.
John or Joan as fully and as richly as God can, if God at that time is actually preventing John or Joan from being able to participate in any way in a meaningful, conscious relationship with God. Now, certainly, resistance to God complicates matters here. Perfect love does not force itself on you. In cases of resistance, then, God's hiding from these people. It's not going to be God's failure here. Rather, it is the finite person that is the cause of that epistemic separation. But again, insofar as the person is not resisting theism, theism strongly suggests that God would always be open to relationship to such a person. Schellenberg puts it this way, and this is one of my favorite quotes of his: the presence of God will be for them like a light, that however much the degree of its brightness may fluctuate, remains on unless they close their eyes. However, there are some people who have their eyes wide open, and yet they still lack belief in God, and for that reason lack a meaningful conscious relationship with God. For example, many close friends of mine have lost their faith against their will and genuinely miss it, but cannot convince themselves to return. They don't see the reasons. Their lack of belief is not the result of any epistemic or moral failing on their end. This non-resistant non-belief is extremely surprising on theism for the reasons already stated. Naturalism, of course, has no tension with the data of non-resistant non-belief because beliefs on naturalism are going to be like any other belief. Believing God is going to be like any other belief, in that they're going to vary and spread from person to person in a natural, organic way. Moreover, the distribution of non-resistant non-belief is lopsided across different populations and across time. For example, according to a 2018 survey, 90%.
Is there anything you wanted to say about this argument?
Let him finish his
Okay,
point.
yeah. Because I have a lot to say, but yeah.
4% of the population of Thailand is Buddhist, and therefore not monotheistic. Or consider the native peoples of the Americas prior to the age of exploration. What about the still isolated tribal peoples? The lopsidedness is surprising if the primary explanation for unbelief in perfect being theism is a moral or rational failure, right? We would have to say something like, these cultures are uniquely immoral or uniquely irrational, but that seems highly implausible. Moreover, naturalism has a ready-made explanation here. The explanation of the existence and distribution of non-resistant non-belief is that monotheism, again, is just like any other cultural idea in how it spreads both geographically and temporally. We wouldn't expect such ideas to be equally available to all individuals at all times. Therefore, the existence and the distribution of non-resistant non-belief is evidence favoring naturalism over theism. In review, I began this presentation by first drawing a contrast between naturalism as I see it and Eric's theism in terms of qualitative simplicity. I then argued that there are three facts about reality for which naturalism is a far better explanation than theism. 1, the evolutionary evils experienced by sentient beings who are not moral agents. 2, the hostility of the universe to the survival of sentient beings who are moral agents. And 3, the non-resistant non-belief and its distribution.
What I will say is that his opening statement is much more modest than than Eric's.
Yeah, because he took a Driparian view and not a logical view. I would give Eric's opening. I'll say a C-. I'll be generous, and I would give Justin.
I'll give Eric a D.
Well, I feel like that's too harsh, but C.
Yeah.
I'll stick with C-, D+ range.
I
would give Justin's opening probably I was gonna say B+, but I think a B is probably good. So significantly better. So I do think that Justin at this point in the debate and overall, but at least in this point in the debate, definitely had the upper hand and had more persuasive arguments if I was in the audience in that way. But yeah, if you want to talk about Justin's
third argument.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I did post about this, and I guess I'll just have to read what I said. But let me see real quick. I'm gonna skip because I mean, you all know, like, I personally dealt with this for like a whole freaking year. Let's see here. So I guess the first thing is that so this is what I said. In order to say that divine hindness or any argument against theism is a disconfirmation, we must ask about what is it about divine hindness that makes it disconfirmatory. So it's going to include certain assumptions about relationships that I think could be objected to. That's the first thing. But more importantly, in order to generate a disconfirmation, we must conjoin theism with an auxiliary hypothesis about value. In this case, auxiliary hypothesis seems to be that God must speak to us through like words or auditory hearings, and not just not just through our hearts or something. But it actually has to be like auditory stuff. But of course, there are other value assumptions that we can use. For example, we can say that God speaks to us through the heart, not words, or that God is interested in us seeking him so that we discover who he really is. Maybe God is interested in building our intellectual virtues so we can have these kind of discussions. And these are all, notice how all these auxiliaries that I'm bringing up, these are all like, they have their own value in themselves, right? And I also don't think that Schellenberg's, I think it's the accommodationist strategy works against some of these examples. So that's what I would say in response. Now, of course, there are some other responses one can give, but basically, I think that it really, I mean, it's not just the third argument, but like every single one of these highly, highly depends upon some kind of axiology to like get these arguments flowing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say if I were debate, I think that was a good answer. I would say if I were doing it, well, I mean, 4 quick things. One of I'm just a Christian universalist, so I don't think anyone's ultimately ever hidden from God. But putting that aside and just assuming that like we're talking about this life, right? I would say one, it's very difficult to know our own psychology, and this is for Christians as well. But people's reasons for belief or unbelief are complicated, and I mean, there are studies about, people in Finland who are atheists who are asked to dare God to do things. And even though they're atheists, they still had blood pressure go up. They still express fear. Now, I'm not saying that this is like proof that they're just suppressing it or that they know that God exists, but I do think that our psychology is complicated, and what we do and don't believe, we don't always even know what we believe. And as Michael Jones would say, that's why we have psychiatrists, right? Often.
Yeah.
To deconstruct that. So that's one thing. But I think the 2 stronger points are that I think there's good reason for God to not give everyone the same experience. And this is, I do talk about this in my stuff on miracles, because the question is, why doesn't God, show himself to everybody or perform a miracle for everyone? And I think among many reasons, right, it establishes humility in our part, but I think it also makes us have to trust other people, right? So we can say, yes, there are people who are desperate, who do reach out to God, who don't get that experience. But there's also plenty of testimonies of people who do claim to have that. And so why should our lack of experience be evidence against someone else's testimony, all else being equal? Like if you don't have reason to distrust them. And that goes into the third point. And just to say that in a world where everyone had the same religious experience, it's like, oh, I experienced God. It's like, yeah, we all do. Like big whoop. Like, yeah, it's great. But I think that the fact that the reason that profound numinous experiences are special is because they're not available to everyone, because we get to see that. I have friends that have claimed to have visions of Jesus in a profound way that I will never understand. And part of me wishes that I have had that. And part of me is thankful that I haven't, because not only do I get to listen to them talk about it, but I also get to view God in a different way through my own experience, and I have my own testimony, and and everyone has a unique way at how they come to it. And I think that itself is a really good thing. Last thing I'll say, and my biggest critique is, I think that to talk about non-resistant non-belief within millions of people is significant, but it's trounced, from what I can tell, by the countless more testimony you have of religious experiences or just general religious intuition. And I think, just that pure number in history of how many people we had in that is going to overcome it. So if we're just doing one testimony of the other, I think the fact that we just have so many more people, and this is not an ad populum argument, by the way, I'm not saying that more people believe it, therefore it's true. But if you're going to posit that all of these people who have religious experiences have something wrong with them, they're either lying or they're more generously deluding themselves in some way, whether it's they're convincing themselves so they want to be true or whatever. All of those critiques can apply to non-resistant non-belief. You can say, well, they just don't know that they're being deceived by their own thoughts, and maybe they don't know what they want and all this stuff, and there's psychological reasons for that. We can make that argument either way. I would say religious experience is more advantageous and has better reasons to be selected. And so if you have to pit religious experience over non-experience, experience wins over, just as it would with blindness or sight.
Well, right? That's the thing. Yeah. So like, I think that, I mean, that's also more moderate because it's taking the amount of religious experiences that people have and then comparing them with how many people don't have that. So, like, in this case, the lack. So, like, obviously, religious experience is completely swamped. It's like if we're comparing them evidentially,
right?
Religious experiences would win out, right?
And it's just more likely to be favored as a properly functioning faculty given evolution.
Now, of course, there might be ways in which the atheist might want to screen off religious experiences or vice versa, right? Maybe, I mean, I have my own way to screen off the disconfirmation of divine hiddenness, but like,
yeah,
if we're going to grant both arguments and like look at them evidentially, then
right.
yeah.
But if we have a burden of proof or a defense we need to give for justifying religious experience, and other than just testimony, then you're going to need to say the same thing for non-resistant non-belief.
Yeah.
Other than just take my word for it, right? And that goes into a different parallel. But yeah, but I think that is significant. And when he talks about population demographics, that is true. Although you got to be a little bit careful because, like, yes, it is true that 90-something% of Thailand is Buddhist and is atheist, but they're not naturalists. Their belief in ghosts is very common in Southeast Asia. Same with Native Americans he cited. Like, yes, they're not monotheists, but a lot of them are animists and stuff like that. So this isn't really helpful for naturalism because if we're going by intuitions and stuff like that, that's still a very rare belief of like pure naturalism that doesn't have some kind of consciousness and some kind of animism or spirit or agency or something like that. That is a profound belief. And there's quite a lot of evidence that children are born with this intuition, that we do associate agents, whether that's God or ghosts or angels or whatever. And actually, that's something that's taught out of us. Now, yes, particular religious doctrines are culturally relative. I don't think anyone denies that. Just as you would say that taste is culturally relative, that different countries have different preferences for foods, and part of that's because of what they've available, and part of that's because of what they've been given and what's been social grain. But you wouldn't argue from the diversity of foods that taste is not an objective feature of the human body. Of course it is, even if it takes different ways. So you can say that religious experience is biologically ingrained and is an objective feature of that of human experience, even if that takes different forms among different religions in that way. So yes, God may have the population demographics differently, and God may be reaching out to them in ways that they best express it. Again, I'm not a super closed, like, exclusivist who think that they all go to hell because they believe in the wrong God, right? But I do think that we're supposed to participate. We're supposed to be missionaries. We're supposed to go and teach them, and God isn't going to reveal to them all of, like, just explain to them all the gospel truths and tell them the correct theology. That's part of where our work needs to come in. And the last thing I'll say, I know this has been a long answer, so I'm sorry.
No, you're
last
good.
thing is just, I would also argue that in many cases, and this is not like a intentionally like malicious on their part, but I do think that a lot of times they haven't looked at all the arguments or the evidence. And I say that just because, again, in my work on miracles, and even like just with published philosophy literature, that's very low in terms of number of publications, and it's very, very much less discussed than other arguments if you comparatively. So I would just say, and as far as your experience as well, that when you look into some of the cases, that really does increase your credence in theism. And I would say that most, not all, but a good portion of people who claim to be not convinced by the evidence have not looked into the evidence, and they may have their views changed. Maybe they won't, but I do think there's quite a lot of evidence out there that hasn't been looked at yet. And so I would throw that out as well, just in that way. So that's a long answer, but
yeah. Did you want to? Yeah, we only went over opening statements, but I mean,
I think this is a good way to wrap up.
Yeah.
I know that they respond, and so they had prepared their responses to. They'd seen each other's openings before they started, so
yeah,
they do it in that way. So maybe for another stream, I don't know. I think we've gone longer, so we don't have to do openings, but just grading the openings. I'm sorry, we don't have to do the rebuttals. Just doing openings. Yeah, we gave our letter grades. I think that Eric does do better in some of the rebuttals. I don't think it's great, but I do think given, and Justin does as well with his rebuttals, I do think in the cross-examination, I do think that Justin handedly won the debate. That is not a diss on Eric as an apologist or as a person.
Well, what I will say is I think Justin had the much better opening statement. So
I agree.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I haven't seen the.
I'm not just saying that because you're watching, Justin.
Hold on. Does Eric use the fall theodicy? I think he does, right?
He does, and then Justin.
Oh yeah, that's
what his view of like the fall is. If he thinks like everything was perfect, then there was a fall of God.
Yeah,
by preemanating the fall, and Eric said he's agnostic. He doesn't. Yeah,
I want to do a blog post on that, and I want to actually like do a collaboration with some other people on it, both theist and atheist, because that is like probably one of the worst theodicies around.
It doesn't even explain, like, even if let's just grant young earth creationism is true. Let's grant that Ken Ham has been right all along, like assuming that we live in a completely different world, and that was the case. I don't see how that makes it better, because then it's like, well, why is it fair that our sin gets put on the animals. Like, why should they bear responsibility for action, right? Like, how is that any fairness in that way, where it just seems like an unfortunate circumstance? I don't see how that fixes the problem. To say that, like, yes, actions have consequences, but to say that there's, unless you do think there's redemption for the animals, which we do, but it still does come off as a little.
I actually have one specific argument against the fall theodicy that shows that, like, it actually, like, if we're going to adopt the fall theodicy, like, it would actually disconfirm theism itself. But I won't. Yeah, but that's for a different discussion. But yeah, that's just what I'll
do
mention.
that, and then have a young Earth creationist on, and then. Sorry, I'm being particularly harsh on them because when I was on Braxton's show, I made a jab at it at one point when I was talking about evidence, and I got like 5 or 6 angry comments about, like, oh, he's right, how is he making fun of being Earth creation? But that's how it is.
Yeah, very true. All right, you ready to end the stream?
Yep, and I don't know if Justin's still watching. If he wants to, I mean, I'll stay on at least if he wants to, and if not, then that's fine or something. But hopefully we did a good job.
Yeah,
hopefully
presenting both views. All right.
Yep.
Later.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.